Okay, now let's talk about policies. This is actually one of my favorite subjects. If you've ever heard my other courses or if you've heard me speak live or even in a training classroom, I'm a big proponent in the aspect that no matter what you do as a IT cybersecurity professional, no matter how many devices you purchase, no matter how many pieces of software you deploy, it always comes down to personnel. They're pretty much the principal weakness of security systems. But by making sure you have appropriate policies in place, you can help to reduce that being your attack vector. So let's take a look at some of the policies that you should definitely look at implementing. Let's start with my favorite. I refer to it as, Psst, what's your password? Or we also refer to it as password and account management policy. This particular policy should be in place to help govern the creation of user accounts, system accounts, assign account privileges according to their job responsibilities, as well as managing the account when the employee basically leaves or even moves to a different department or division. Now, this policy should also make sure that your users take the appropriate steps in actually protecting the integrity of their accounts. This would include things such as password complexity, not disclosing their password to somebody else, keeping any authentication tokens safe, and of course, if they lose those tokens, they need to notify somebody right away. And of course, the famous leaving a system logged in while you walk away without three fingers saluting it. Now, you may have heard this story before if you've heard some of my other courses, but my wife used to be a VP for Blockbuster Video. Yes, back in the day, folks, we used to go to brick and mortar stores to rent something called a VHS tape. And then they came out with these silver plastic discs called DVDs. And if you didn't have the player, you could rent it for like $19 a night. She actually started with the company as an assistant manager and worked her way up within the organization. So this situation took place when a customer came up to the front counter to check out their VHS tape. And inside the tape box was the wrong movie. Well, the CSR, thinking that they were going to be polite and helping the customer, which they were, they didn't log out the computer, but they walked back to get the right tape. Well, the customer looked over the counter and saw their account information being displayed. And then there were some notes put in by a different CSR, and that's customer service rep, that weren't very flattering, complaining about how the customer was a real pain in the cahootskis. Anyway, this resulted in a lawsuit. And very quickly, a policy being issued that if you didn't three finger salute when you walked away from your monitor or your console, you were immediately let go. Now, another type of policy that we want to implement would be one that's called the acceptable use policy. Now, this particular policy might also be referenced as a fair use policy. And what it's designed to do is it's designed to set out what someone is allowed to use a particular service or resource for. Now, it could include things like how employees use equipment or services such as the internet or telephone service that is provided to them at their place of business. Now, typically, this policy will forbid the use of the equipment to do things like obviously defraud, defame, or even obtain illegal materials. It typically will also include things like prohibit the installation of unauthorized hardware or software into systems, and explicitly forbid actual or attempted intrusion of snooping. So that means that it could actually forbid internet tools for eavesdropping. Now, making sure that you enforce the acceptable use policy is probably the most important thing that you can do to protect the organization from security as well as legal implications of employees, or for that matter, customers misusing the equipment. Now that we've talked about what's acceptable, this kind of leads us down the road of, hey, what is none of your business? Now, the right to privacy is one expected by all citizens of most countries. However, the right to privacy has to be balanced against the needs of companies we work for, as well as the companies we shop with, and the data that they collect about us. Now, there's something called the workplace surveillance or right to monitor. This can be divided into three different categories. One of them would be the security assurance, meaning that we can monitor data communications and employees' behaviors to make sure that they're not giving out confidential information or that they're not trying to compromise the security of our company. Another category would be monitoring data. So analyzing data communications to measure the employee's productivity. A great example of this is I worked for a training center where they had a piece of software that monitored inbound and outbound calls and which salesperson was doing that and how long their conversations were. Well, that's to make sure that, again, that the employee is doing their job and not taking advantage of the company. And then, of course, the third one is the physical monitoring. This is where we see things like CCTV systems or alcohol and drug testing, anything that records the employee's movements, locations, their behaviors within the workplace. Now, that being said, that right to privacy kicks back in when I, for example, go to the bathroom. They can't put a TV or a camera in there. Well, they could put a TV. I'd probably be in there a little bit longer. But they can't put a TV in a bathroom to make sure I'm not stealing from them, because everybody has the right to that privacy. Now, a really good employer will make sure that the procedures for surveillance is very clear and unambiguous, and they typically have the employees sign those policies. Now, the next policy would be one that we refer to as class and ownership. So you work for the company and you create products, right? Or you create documents. Well, sometimes those documents might be subjected to what they refer to as a workflow, from creation all the way to retention and then even destruction. Now, whoever creates the data is considered the data owner, and they're normally responsible for managing that workflow. I mean, if you create a bunch of Word documents, you're typically required to make sure that you delete them or make sure they're secure. Now, part of the workflow will involve classifying the data as either public, private, confidential, secret, or dun, 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 top secret. Now, there are several products out there that can help users in this classification. Off the top of my head, I happen to know Microsoft products. SharePoint does this really, really well. Now, the biggest challenge for most companies is preventing the IT department from becoming the owner of all data the company has, or preventing the administrators from becoming the de facto data owner by virtue of the fact that they have certain privileges and access to the network. Next up, we have our data retention policy, or as I like to call it, back it up, my daddy taught me good. And if you're not familiar with that song, YouTube, back it up, my daddy taught me good. Make sure you watch the actual interview before you watch the remix. But what we're talking about here is backing up and archiving as a way of protecting us if information is lost or damaged somehow. Now, typically data retention needs to be considered in two different terms, either in short-term or long-term. Now, when it comes to short-term, files that change frequently have to be retained for version control. And here comes SharePoint again, because it's a great product for implementing version control. Short-term retention is also important in recovering files that may be infected by a virus or even ransomware. Now, with long-term, data may need to be stored to meet legal requirements or to comply with your company's policies or possibly even industry standards. Now, once the data no longer needs to be retained, we need to then talk about how it's destroyed. Now, it's because of the reasons of us having to worry about both long-term and short-term that backups are actually kept at certain points in time. Now, as backups take up a ton of space, and there's never unlimited storage capabilities, right? This introduces the need for both storage management routines and techniques that help to reduce the amount of data occupied in our storage backup media. And then we have the policy of who's on first, what's on second. Now, this is actually the separation of duties, job rotation, and mandatory vacations, which we've talked about previously. Again, your company should not be naive in the aspect that there's a possibility that employees may attempt to defraud or vandalize resources. By separating duties, this means that we establish checks and balances against the possibility that critical systems or procedures could be compromised by employee threats. Now, there are several different policies that we can apply to enforce the separation of duties, such as dual control or shared authority, or the principle of least privilege, so that the user has the ability to do their job, but no more than that, as well as effective auditing, which means that decisions and changes are recorded and can be scrutinized independently of the person that made the decision. And of course, one of my favorites is rotation of duty. This makes sure that not one person is permitted to remain on the job for an extended period of time. This also actually helps to balance out from an HR perspective so that you are educating or making your users expand, or I shouldn't use expand, it'd be more stretch themselves in their knowledge. And of course, mandatory vacations, which means employees are forced to take their vacation, allowing somebody else to fulfill their duties. So at the end of the year, when you calculate how much vacation time the person has, you would ask yourself, well, who gets the vacation? Well, all 2 weeks of it. That's why the man's entitled to it. So who gets it? Why shouldn't he? Sometimes his wife will go with him. Whose wife? Yes. After all, the man's earned it. Come on, do I really need to continue with Abbott and Costello?